Now, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You're very, very welcome. It's lovely to be back here, but tonight, the night belongs to Matthew Stout, who is a very familiar name to us. Matthew was in Roscrea and Ikerrin back in the mid-80s, doing a lot of archaeological work, and tonight he's going to speak to us not only on that, on Ikerrin, but on other areas as well. So, Matthew, welcome.
Thank you very much. And if I told you how thrilled I was to be in North Tipperary, you wouldn't believe me. You'd think it was just something I say as I do the circuit. Like, hello, Thurles, it's great to be back. But it is great to be back. It's always great to be back in Tipperary. And it's also great to be anywhere after the last 2 years. Mary contacted me about this talk. I just looked at my earliest email. On October 12th in 2019, we made the arrangements for this talk. And here we are now. The heroes of this story are, it's not myself. The heroes of the story, I suppose, is my wife Geraldine, who would be well known to some. But also I have to give great credit to George Cunningham. Of course, anyone, I don't know how familiar people are with George, but he was, if you're in Roscrea, you certainly know who George Cunningham is. And you know that there is not a swimming pool where the castle used to be, because one of the things that the Roscrea Heritage Society managed to do was stop the construction, the knocking down of Damer House and the construction of the swimming pool. What that meant was that they had a building, they had Damer House, and they had this wonderful annex to Damer House, and they had to find something to do with all that space. And it was George's vision at the time to work with Anco. Anco, I don't know how much work they did in Thurles, but Anco rebuilt Roscrea and did wonderful work. And George got Anco involved in supporting the first archaeological survey undertaken as an Anco employment scheme. And my wife was brought down to work, and of course I came along with her. In the winter of '82, we first spent our time in Roscrea. We did a cutting of the fosse outside the castle in Roscrea in 1982, and I just show that picture there. Anyone who's been on an archaeological excavation appreciate how straight those faces are. Anyway, obviously we did such a wonderful job of keeping the faces straight on that excavation that George had us back in 83 and 84 to undertake archaeological surveys. And there was a folklore survey thrown in there as well. We were very busy, and it was just a wonderful time and a wonderful opportunity. Things that we did when we were there, we organized an exhibition that won for Roscrea the Exhibition of the Year award, and it also won a very large prize in the European Museums of the Year competition. So it was a really it was a really exciting project, and I suppose part of the fact that I'm so thrilled to be in North Tipperary is that was a very important part in our career. It was Geraldine's first big job of work after finishing her MA, and it was the place where I began really to think about ringforts. And I've been thinking about ringforts, believe it or not, ever since. And as I was saying to Tom Ryan here, I have ringforts on Google Alert. Ringfort isn't a word that's used very often, so I'm not snowed under with references, but maybe every month I might get something about someone writing something about ringforts, and I just try to keep up and do a little bit of work as I go along myself. So we had this idea with George. We worked out this idea with George is that we would do an archaeological survey, and we began in Ikerrin, the barony of Ikerrin. My younger students have no idea whatsoever what a barony is. And try to explain to a Dubliner what a townland is nearly impossible. But the barony loomed very large, and the barony was the ideal unit of land because the county is just too big to manage. The barony allowed us to survey every single site, not to pick and choose as is necessary when doing a county-wide survey. And the whole glory of doing an archaeological survey is to spend time with the sites, to spend time at the sites. I am not, what's the word? Luddite, I suppose is the word. I use computers. I've been known to use statistics. But if you want to understand a thing, you have to really draw it. And that's why sometimes the computer methods that are available to us today can be too easy. If I could draw a ringfort from the air, I don't really appreciate where it is, how it's made, how high the banks are, what its views are, what its neighbors are like. And that interconnectedness is part of what matters when you're looking at the individual sites. Any individual site, it could be a ringfort, it could be a megalith, it doesn't matter. You have to be there. You have to experience and you have to spend some time with it. And I had the rare pleasure to spend 2 glorious summers. 83 and 84 were glorious summers in the field surveying these sites. And I kind of focused on the earthworks. Geraldine and Jimmy Connors. There's Jimmy up there. My wife and Jimmy, who was an architectural technician, more or less focused on doing the building. So I was really focusing on the earthworks. And the great thing about an archaeological survey, and this is how I think it worked in so well with the ANCO system, is that there's a job for everyone. It's kind of like an excavation as well. There's all kinds of work that's necessary on an excavation for all abilities and all inclinations, okay? So you've got, this is the method we use for surveying the sites. It's an old-fashioned, but it's still extremely reliable method of using a plane table for the plans and using a level for the sections. We brought them into the annex, or rather the stables at the back of Roscrea, and we did all our analysis. And we had, like I say, we had experts from the European Museum of the Year competition visit us, and we had a wonderful crew who made it possible, because these sites can be very, very overgrown, and to do a proper survey, you have to cut your way through the undergrowth so that everything, if you like, gets visible. We did 200 ringforts. Now, eventually, don't get too alarmed. Eventually, I'm going to tell you what a ringfort is. But the point about it is, we surveyed over in the course of the year, in the course of 2 seasons, in the barony of Ikerrin in North Tipperary, and in Clonlisk in southwest Offaly. We surveyed in the region of probably about 300 sites, and 200 of those, over 200 of those, were upstanding ringforts, which is ultimately going to become the subject of this talk. Now, for those of you who know Roscrea, these are very bad scans of what were absolutely fabulous photographs taken by Brian Redmond, and Brian Redmond still is photographing still in Roscrea. So, as I say, we surveyed in 83 and 84, and we did so, sorry, I want to show this picture as well. We did so when the great era of archaeological destruction was just coming to an end. When Ireland joined the EU in 73, money became available for the creation of, I think the main culprit was the creation of fields for silage. And the money suddenly became available for JCBs to take out fences. And as I worked in archaeology through the 70s and into the 80s, we constantly came upon sites where the farmer said, more or less, they were doing the drainage works. While you're here, you might as well take out the ringfort, or take out that thing while you're at it. About one third of the monuments of Ireland were destroyed in that period between 73 and 94. In 73, the money became available. In 94, legislation was passed that protected every archaeological site in the country. But between those two times, those were bad times, if you like, for archaeological destruction. But nonetheless, we worked with what we had. We had 2/3 of the upstanding archaeology surviving, and we did detailed drawings of every single site in the baronies of Ikerrin and Clonlisk. In addition to which, we did an awful lot of analysis that is still worthwhile to this day, because when Geraldine published her archaeological survey of the barony of Ikerrin, by the way, this is I'm told it's a very extremely rare photograph, because President Hillary apparently spent most of his presidency golfing, and this is a rare occasion where he actually launched a book, and he launched the barony of Ikerrin in 1984. It has 183 detailed plans and sections. There's no survey ever published that has that much detail in it. Now, there are wonderful things done in Donegal, in Kerry, and Louth, but no survey has ever been done in which every site that could be drawn was drawn. And that, again, as I say, is the advantage of working in a barony. Clonlisk, unfortunately, was never published in this form. Geraldine got a job in the Sites and Monuments Record office in Dublin. I came up to Dublin and went to college, and Clonlisk never got published. But all the material from Clonlisk was incorporated into the files of the National Monument Service, and worked its way into a paper that I published in 1991 on the Ringforts in the southwest Midlands of Ireland. So, this work at the time was. I had at my fingertips, at the time, the largest amount of data relating to archaeological sites the largest and most detailed body of data relating to archaeological sites in the island. Starting to talk this way is both to acknowledge the importance that Roscrea played in the history of the study of Irish archaeology. It's a chance for me to take a trip down memory road, because we had such wonderful times in Roscrea. Roscrea was really, really good to us. But it's in Roscrea that I began to think about how Ringforts needed to be studied, what was important, what needed to be recorded, and then I began to think of ways of how some sense could be made of that incredible distribution of these sites. I began to see that, where they were in relationship to obviously to good land or to sloping land, how important that was. How there were sites that had big banks. There were sites that had 2 banks. There were ringforts that had which were very small and had little banks. And you begin to think, just by traveling around, if you've looked at any of the sites in your own area, you begin to think about hierarchy and status, because you got big ones and little ones. And so that sort of draws that sort of leads you on into trying to understand what's going on. How, not only what are these sites, that's one question, but the next question also is, what can they tell us? And so Tipperary is, if you like, where all that began. And then when I went on to do my studies, I took it from there. But I think I've got ahead of myself, because I want to talk about ringforts, so I better say something about what ringforts were. Well, first off, there's 47,000 of them in Ireland, and which is a staggering number. It is the most important type of archaeological site in Ireland, simply because of the sheer number of them. The majority of archaeological sites in Ireland are ringforts. Ringforts, as I'll go on to talk about, were occupied by both kings and commoners, and so it is a very unusual monument that gives us a glimpse into all of society at the time. And those are vague terms. I'm deliberately vague now. I'm going to try to sharpen that language up eventually. At the time, okay, what time? Well, I'm going to talk about that later. But there are so many of them. It was not just the homes of the elite. And having archaeological sites that are not the sites of the elite is very rare for any period in Ireland. Show me a late medieval house. Well, you'd have trouble finding one. You can find many tower houses, but you won't find many late medieval houses. Except for during the time of the Ringforts, it's really just the archaeological sites belonging to the elite that survive. So this makes a Ringfort a really exciting, exciting to me, potentially exciting field of research. So, what is a Ringfort? A Ringfort is the least glamorous side of early medieval Irish settlement. It's without question that if we have a concept of early Christian Ireland, or early medieval Ireland, the time from Patrick to the time of the Anglo-Normans, if we have any concept of that period, it's generally speaking dominated by things ecclesiastical. It's called the early Christian period for a start. I suppose the term early medieval is used now because outside of Ireland, early Christian refers to a different period altogether. So we think of the high crosses, the Book of Kells, the Arda Chalice. Think of these great works of art and of architecture that relate to the ecclesiastical side of the equation. But the majority of people in early medieval Ireland, as in our own time, are farmers and laborers. The majority of people are not artists and craftsmen and bishops. Okay, so if we want to understand how this happened, we have to look at the secular side of the equation, the non-religious side of the equation, to see how it worked. Because the churches were very wealthy, but where does that wealth come from? And that's where we have to understand the secular side of the settlement equation. So, as important as the church is, and the more I work on the subject of early medieval Ireland, the more I realize just how important it is. I know when I was writing my Ringfort book, I probably didn't mention the church at all. I didn't want to talk about the church, but it is an extremely important subject. But it's the secular side of things that I want to look at. So there's a map, and if you take a few minutes, you can count 47,000 dots on it. There is a better version of that is in the new edition of the Atlas of the Irish Rural Landscape, and you can see. Actually, this is something of an aside, but if you look at the two maps in the two editions of the Atlas of the Irish Rural Landscape, one in 97 and one in 2012, you can see how much work the Archaeological Survey of Ireland had done in the period in between. Because what they've been doing over the last decades is going out and visiting the site and positively identifying them and measuring them. So more and more of those sites that are on this map are definite Ringforts. But it also includes sites that have been destroyed and are 90% likely to be Ringforts. But that is the map of them. And because there's so many of them, they are what give us the majority of Irish place names. If you think of the Irish townland as a system of land ownership or a farming system that goes back into the early medieval period, well, then you could certainly understand how those names would incorporate ringforts. And so you get townlands named Rath, or Cahir, or Cashel, or Doon, or Liss, as in Thurles. Now, Liss is a vague sort of a term as far as place names are concerned. Liss is an enclosure. So a Liss can be Lismore, it could be an early Christian, it could be an ecclesiastical enclosure. So it's not as specific. The word in the original sources for a ringfort is Doon. D-U-N. And because it doesn't pluralize, if that's a word, I think I didn't invent the word Doon, but maybe I invented the word pluralize. You can't say dunes. So that word is not used. We're talking about dunes, but the term that archaeologists use is ringforts, because like Cranoga, it doesn't quite pluralize easily. Rath is a term that's often applied to these sites, but Rath is not a term specific to ringforts in the early sources. And this is what a ringfort is. If you haven't seen one from the air, and we can, in those days when I think Daphne Push and Mole took that photograph, it was hard to get up in the air. Now we can all do it with a drone. But the point about it is you can see that they appear as isolated circular enclosures, usually more than 80% of them. Oftentimes 88% of them, 88% is a good number there, are enclosed by just a single bank and a single ditch. Okay? And you can see that they are not nucleated like a town. They are dispersed. They represent communities of farmers. But we're not talking about cities. And what a ringfort is an individual family farm from the early Middle Ages. In stony areas, they're made out of stone. That kind of makes sense, I guess. And there they can be called cahirs or cashels. But basically, we're dealing with the same thing. Although we still don't have a really good study of cahirs and cashels in a good published study of cahirs and cashels. Between 12 and 20% of ringforts in any given area are surrounded by two banks. And the term for that is bivalent, if you like. A vallum is the bank. And so if you've got one bank around a ringfort, it's a univalent ringfort. And if it's got two banks, it's a bivalent ringfort. And you can also notice how it was respected by the builders of the road. And I'd say a little bit more about that, about the respect of these sites as I go along. There are big ringforts and little ringforts. All right, and that's one of the reasons why I love this photograph. And if this is something, if you talk about the changing landscape, this was taken by Aerofilms probably in the 60s. And if you look at it today on Google Earth, it's just totally different. First off, there's a motorway running right through here. But it is just, the landscape has changed. The farming methods have changed the way the ground looks. It's just that simple. But here you have a typical univalent site there. And then you have here a very large ringfort, and it's not a church site. It's a large ringfort with a little bit of a division in it. So that's the kind of thing that I started looking at when I was in Ikerrin, and that's the kind of thing that I'm still looking at, is the relationship between, the different types of ringforts as we go along. And the other thing that's important here is that ringforts are found from the north, the south, the east, the west, the entirety of the island of Ireland. And one of the things the ringfort tells us is that there is this incredible cultural unity in the island of Ireland in the early medieval period. And it's that cultural unity, the one language, the one law, the one farming system. It's that cultural unity that makes it possible for Ireland to thrive in what was an extraordinarily chaotic, against the background of extraordinarily chaotic politics. Go online and read the annals of Ireland. Battle after battle after battle after. At any one time in Ireland, more than 180 kings. The term is often given 100. You know, this is just something I've been writing about lately. F.J. Byrne says there was always at least 150 kings in Ireland. But I think he just couldn't. The number is much higher than that. And I think even F.J. Byrne was kind of staggered by that number. So it's at least 180. There was 180 different kingships in Ireland in the post-Viking period. So the number prior to the Vikings is over 200. Now, an island that's constantly at war with itself could not have survived if it did not have this cultural unity. And of course, the church is a big part of that as well. Okay, so when we're looking at ringforts, we're looking at something that's akin to the glue, which is keeping this society from tearing itself apart. And that's just a side in the bend of the Boyne, because no matter where you are, you get them. And there are fewer of them upstanding in the areas that are more developed agriculturally, but regardless, they're there. Okay? Now, that's a reconstruction of a ring fort. And this here is a ring fort house that was built in UCD. Now, they have in UCD they have a wonderful program of practical archaeology, but they built this house, and so they know exactly how a circular ring fort house worked and how they constructed it. And you can see that in early medieval Ireland, everything is circular. The enclosure, now churches were square, but the enclosures around churches were circular, ring forts were circular, the houses within the ring forts were circular. It's only when the Vikings came in that they started building squares. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with the book Black Elk Speaks, which is a Native American writing about his youth, and he's talking about their life and how much a part of nature they were. And he says that the Bureau of Indian Affairs made them live in square houses, in concrete block square houses. And he says in the book, there is no power in a square. I don't know what it is about societies, the difference between societies that build in round ones, but the early medieval people were certainly taking on what Black Elk was talking about, the power of a circle. Now, a circular structure is also mathematically the most efficient. You enclose the most area per unit of enclosing bank. Okay? So it's the most efficient structure for building an enclosure. Much more efficient. Normans came along and started building square ones, but these are much more efficient in terms of space. And then the whole idea of, there's also the culture of the devil hiding in corners, where there weren't many corners in early medieval Ireland to hide in. So that is part of it. The ring forts were so common, as I say, 47,000 of them. The ring forts are so common that there's extensive number of references to them in early Irish literature. And this allows us, that's not a very good photograph, but it does show you what a house looks like. When you excavate a ring fort, you find circular houses. And that's a circular house, kind of has anyone ever been in Bari? Has anyone ever seen a Trulli in Apulia in Italy? You have? Well, you know, in the Trullis, they don't make a bigger one, they just add another one to it. And the same is true in early medieval Ireland. If you were extending your house you would build another little roundhouse at the back of it. And that's what you had here at this site, this very important excavation in Deer Park Farms, where they found these figure of 8 houses. Oh, and before I talk about references to ringforts in literature, this slide here reminds me to tell you what time we're talking about when we talk about ringforts. And this is this is a crucial point, because I remember my daughter's junior cert books, history books, first chapter was called Life in the Bronze Age, and it was all about ringforts. Now, there was early work which did suggest that ringforts were in the Bronze Age, and then there was other work that suggests ringforts were continually built until the 1700s. And in one way, if they were built between the Bronze Age and 1700s, well, that would explain why there were so many of them. But this is not the case. Now, in my book, The Irish Ringfort, came out in '97. It was clear then what the dates of ringforts were. But since the tsunami of scientific dates came to us with all the construction that took place during the Celtic Tiger, and some very sophisticated statistical analysis on the part of Tom Kerr, we have a very clear idea of the date of ringforts, and it's even more confined than I would have thought in '97, or that Chris Lynn would have thought before that. 550 to 850. It is a very specific time in Irish history. It's early medieval Ireland before the Vikings. It's the early medieval Ireland of the Brehon law. It is Ireland's golden age. And to understand how the golden age happens, you can see the dynamism in the landscape, where 47,000 families built ringforts in what is a fairly short period of time. Okay? Now, 300 years, long enough, but the point about it is this is a society which maybe went from 250,000 to 500,000 people in that period. So things are expanding. Cattle are produced, cattle are traded, wealth is created, and that all feeds its way into the church. If you want to understand how the Book of Kells happened, it happens because of the dynamic economy that the ringforts are testimony to. And that's just putting the dates of ringforts into its context between the Bronze Age and the 17th century. Okay? So these are early medieval sites. There are still pockets of resistance. The further west you go, the more you might hear about medieval ringforts, but they don't exist. It's a very confined, very, very strict period in Irish occupation history. And then this gets back to, as I said, that because there's this time when people are living in ringforts. Now, this poem here was written in the probably in the 11th or 12th century, but it's actually set in the 8th century, very accurately set. And it's about a person who is possessed by the devil, and the devil's in this guy's stomach. And so he dreams constantly, he thinks constantly of food. And he has a dream of going to a ring fort made out of food. The fort we reached was beautiful with works of custard stick beyond the lock. New butter was the bridge in front. The rubble dyke was wheat and white, bacon the palisade. Stately pleasantly it sat, a compact house and strong. Then I went in. The door of it was dry meat. The threshold was bare bread, cheese curds the sides. I love that poem because you could draw a ring fort from it. You know it's got a bank and a palisade. It's got a house in the middle. But you can also see what the dominant economy was in early medieval Ireland, because all the references, most of the references, there's a reference to bacon, but most of the references in there, and that very short references in that short passage, are to milk products. Because the key feature of the early medieval economy was the rearing of cows. Not just cattle, but specifically cows. And a person's status was based on how many cows they had. And cows had the status of, almost, as I say, almost of people. They were that important. And because cows were the main source of wealth, that meant there was an awful lot of milk products in the diet. Okay? You don't get lactose intolerant. Well, you don't get many lactose intolerant people in Ireland. You'll get celiacs, but not lactose intolerant, because that was anybody who was lactose intolerant was not going to survive the early middle ages. And the other thing then is, if the basis of your wealth is the cow, then the ringfort becomes the ideal means of protecting the source of your wealth. Why are there 47,000 ringforts in Ireland? It's because that's how you protect what was important. And when cattle lose their importance in the post-Viking period, the number of ringforts goes into decline. Okay? And that's a little bit of Marxist interpretation there, but that's really basically how it works. Here's another poem. This is a contemporary account written about a fort occupied between those dates. Those are the kings. The fort opposite the Oakwood. Once it was bridges, it was Cahals, it was Aids, it was Ails, it was Connaughs, and it was Cullinas, and it was Melduans. The fort remains after each in his turn, and the kings asleep in the ground. And here we have what's really, this is a subject of another lecture entirely, but my analysis of distribution of ringforts, which is what I've basically been doing since my time in Roscrea, hinges on the fact that you look at a distribution in the landscape, and you say to your assumption is that mirrors the distribution of the time. Okay? Now that's a big assumption, because what if half the ringforts in one place were destroyed and the other ones were left? Or what if they built lots of ringforts in 550 and then they didn't build another one until 900? But this poem supports my view that, generally speaking, when we look at the population of 47,000 ringforts, that they are roughly contemporary with each other, and therefore it is a fair thing to assume that they have that when we look at how they relate to each other in the landscape, we're looking at how family farms related to one another back in the day. Okay, now that is I say it's the assumption that all analyses of archaeological distributions have to cope with, but that's very good evidence for that. This was the time of the Brehon laws. The Brehon laws were obsessed with status, because what your status was determined how you were treated in law, how you were treated, what your duties were. Everything depended on your status, and the laws recognized that. The Brehon laws are much better when it tell us about society, because if you looked at the laws of Ireland today, you might think that everyone was equal. There is no law for the rich, no one law for the rich and one law for the poor. There's just one law. And you might think, if you were to study Ireland 1,000 years from now, you might say, all the Irish people were equal. And maybe that would be a mistake. Okay? But the Brehon laws recognized the inequality that was there, because that was the basis of law, was inequality, these questions of status. And so we get some very detailed descriptions of ringforts and houses and everything relating to the different types of people that were living in Ireland. And it goes on, and it gives you statistics, it gives you figures. And it says that a ringfort is 70 feet of perfect feet on every side. So in other words, the ringfort is 42 meters, but the ringfort belonging to the king is 42 meters in diameter. And it just so happens that when you look at the diameters of bivalent sites in Ireland, that statistic is very, very close to 42 meters. And then it also goes on to describe a rampart, a type of ringfort where the these are all Victorian translations, and it doesn't really, the whole idea of the ramparts of vassalage. The point is, if you were a client of a fella, if you were a person's inferior, part of your duties was to help him build his ring fort. And so the more people who were your vassals or your clients, the bigger banks you could build. And the ramparts of vassalage, to use the Victorian translation, refer to a bivalent ring fort. So without question, the early assumptions that I made in the field in Roscrea about bivalent ring forts representing the sites belonging to royalty, well, that's confirmed in Brehon law. It also goes on to describe the different people in society. It describes one individual, one very powerful person, whose job it is to defend a territory to the 4 compass points of battle. Now, if you're defending something to the 4 compass points of battle, you've got to be a central location. And those big, important ring forts are usually centrally located within townlands. There is another person described in early Irish law, which is known as the Bow Era, the cow lord. Bow is cow and Era is lord. And the Bow Era held 70 acres of land. And that is, if you look at the studies, the wonderful studies of Willie Smith in South Tipperary, 70 acres of land is a good size farm until the advent of modern, less sustainable agriculture. There's another person called the O'Gara, or the young lord, who didn't have his own land. He had to rent land. And he rented a farm of 35 acres. And 35 acres, Willie Smith has shown in South Tipperary, is the magic number. If you had a farm of 35 acres, you could survive in the post-famine period in Ireland. If you had a farm under 35 acres, your days were numbered. And it just so happens that the smallest sustainable farm that's referred to in early Irish law is 35 acres. And that's the law, that's the size of the farm belonging to a young lord. And early Irish society was different than a lot of places in Europe at this time and subsequent times, particularly under feudalism. In early Ireland, you could improve your position in society. You were called a young lord. You could be an old young lord. You could be an old O'Gara if you didn't improve yourself, if you didn't get a farm of your own. But you could advance, and certainly that was possible in a place where there were over 200 kings at any one time. Now think of it, a population of 500,000 people, there's over 200 kings. There are the families of those kings who also want to be king. There are the families of the people who used to be kings. There's an awful lot of royalty around. And so there is the potential of progress. But if you look in the sources, one of the things that the sources confirm is that from the highest to this lowest level of the O'Gara, every free man in rural Ireland lived within a ring fort. That's the way it worked. And this, if you like, is the sum total of all the work that I did in Ikerrin and Clonlisk. This is a drawing that I produced in the paper that I published in 1991. And what that drawing does is spare you all the stuff. But the point about it is, at the end of the day, this is what I come up with. Because what you see there is how ring forts are located in the barony of Ikerrin. You can see that you get, in upland areas, you get lots of little ring forts. There's lots of, this is Killiskean, this is to the west of the Devil's Bit. And you get lots of little sites up in the uplands above Killiskean. And you have, in places where you get lots of these little forts, you generally speaking get one large site. And here you can see the whole idea of protection. You can see that those people who the O'Gara is described as not having adequate means. So they're living in a very small ringfort, and they are relying on they are clients of a larger farmer. That larger farmer could be a high up lord. That larger farmer could be a king. But remember, the kings are farmers too. The description of an ancient Irish kingdom of a tua, I think the best description I read is that they were communities of farmers. So if you are insecure, you have to rely on the protection of someone who is more important and more powerful. And so you get that juxtaposition between small sites and lots of small sites and a very big site. Now that's Ikerrin, but that relationship was also found in Kerry. It was found in Croghan in Roscommon. I don't know if it was found in Boher Lahan or not, but this is the kind of thing that I would really be interested in finding out from people doing work on local distributions of ringforts, is how that plays out. The Boera, that strong farmer, that man who had these ringforts would have been occupied by extended families. There would be the farmer, the wife, children, maybe the grandparents, some retainers, the odd slave. There were slaves in that time. But the strong farmer is well-off farmer. This independent farmer lives in an average-sized ringfort, or at least this is the way I think of it, and they are more or less isolated, more distributed across the landscape in good land, but not necessarily very strategic land. And so you can see there's the Boeras these are just the ordinary farmers living in ordinary ringforts as you go along there. And these very small sites are the sites that belong to the O'Gara. And then lastly, now, there are 5 types of ringforts. Okay, there are 7 deadly sins, but there's only 5 types of ringforts, right? There's the bivalent ringfort. There's the typical univalent ringfort. There's the small upland ringfort. There is the small low-lying platform ringfort. It's kind of low-lying, but it's got its ground. The ground of the ringfort is raised above the ground level because of poor drainage. And you also have very large sites that were on strategic boundaries. And these large sites often have internal divisions, like that ringfort I showed you early on, suggesting that more than one thing is going on within that ringfort. Whether it's a place, whether it's a place where you could stay, or whether it's a place where you could accumulate an army for interterritorial struggles. All we know is there's this one very large univalent type site. So that's 5 sites, if you like. That's what the computer analysis comes up with. And they are represented on that illustration there. This you can, if you have the stomach for this, you can read about it in both either the book on ringforts or on the paper. I think the library gets JSTOR, doesn't it? Yeah, the library gets JSTOR. So if you had the stomach for this, for more detail, you can read my paper that was published in the Royal Irish Academy in 1991. So I'm not going to say too much more about that. I have published 6 subsequent work on how the practicalities of early Irish farming. I am a member of the Agricultural History Society of Ireland, and at one point we had a farmer who actually got Kerry cattle, who are the closest we have to what the early medieval cattle would have been like. He got them, he put them out in the field, he showed that they thrived, that you don't need to put Kerry cattle indoors in the winter because the Irish didn't keep hay, the Irish didn't house their animals. The early medieval Irish didn't keep hay or house their animals. And he worked it out. He said that the description in early Irish law of a farm is workable, even in our own time. I want to just conclude then with Some of the bit about ringforts that is not quite relates to archaeology, but certainly relates to what most of us experience when we are engaging with ringforts in the field, and that's the traditions that are associated with ringforts. Ever since they were abandoned, sometime around 900, people were not building them; they were not living in them anymore. So ever since around 900, people have been trying to make sense of these circular things that are just, found in the field. And as time goes on, and the enclosures and the landscape of Ireland is enclosed in the square fields, these little circular monuments are going to cause people to just to wonder. And as early as Giraldus Cambrensis, writing in 1185 about the Anglo-Norman invasion, Giraldus Cambrensis writes about a haunted ringfort. He's here in 1185, Gerald of Wales. He writes about an abandoned ringfort that is haunted. So you go back to the association between ringforts and the other world as far back as in 1185. And those traditions have just been piling on ever since. I don't know if any of you know where Grega is. I don't think it's too far away from here. This is just the school's manuscripts, in which so much of this information was recorded, are all online, and a lot of them have been transcribed, and it's all searchable. So if you're interested in what the folklore in your particular area is, you can find it it's on the site known as Ducas. But the point about it is that there are traditions about ringforts which are very well. They don't vary much. They're leprechauns. There are giant rabbits. There's gold, and there's danger if you get involved in altering a ringfort in any way, shape, or form. And you can see the problem that people are having on taking timber out of a ringfort. In this instance, worse things can happen than having your billhook break. You can break your neck. And when we were working in 83 and 4, people were constantly, the farmers we met, were constantly concerned for our safety, because we had to do so much clearing of ringforts to survey them. And we used to always say, of course, that we're okay because we're on their side. We're trying to preserve these sites. It's what happened to the archaeology of Ireland. It suffered most between the time when people stopped believing this and the time when we had adequate legislation in 94. So that's when the destruction happened. When the money was available, people began to lose the beliefs they had about ringforts, and that's when the destruction took place. But it's an endlessly fascinating subject, and it's one I've only just sort of, if you like, dabbled in. But there's so much in the school's manuscripts collection about the folklore of ringforts. The folklore of ringforts can divide itself into two types. There's the whole idea of the fairies, but there's also the ideas that ringforts are part of a system of settlement. The people who have the view is that you can see from every fairy fort in Ireland, you can see 8 others. There's the idea that that these are communities, that there's some kind of interaction, and that was a very strong belief about ringforts even before people knew what date they were, or how narrowly dated they in fact are. That idea about the intervisibility of ringforts is what protected these different communities. And this is just a wonderful piece of work that was done in Antrim, where the person went to every ringfort and drew what they could see from every site. And you can see that the number beside every site is the number of ringforts you can see from each ringfort. So there's some where you can see 13 other sites. I mean, the density of ringforts in places can be extraordinary. I was just looking at the study in the Boer Latin Historical Journal. There's over 1,000 ringforts in North Tipperary. In Boherland, I see there's 3 times the number of ringforts than would be expected. The distributions of sites is very dense, and some of the folklore that exists captures that interrelatedness. And that's the interrelatedness that is what preserves the people within the sites. That if somebody is in danger, they can come to the aid of their neighbor or escape to their neighbor. And there was constant warfare, constant stealing of cattle, constant turmoil. And so the ringforts, the intervisibility of ringforts, helped to sustain the system. And just very briefly, that system came to an end. It came to an end because societies naturally evolve. It became to the end because Ireland was developing sort of a kind of a proto-feudalism from what had been a more primitive type of economic system. And ringforts, the nature of ringforts changed. They became larger and they were occupied by fewer people. And so when we get to the post-Viking period, we have evidence of very large sites, and those very large sites are linked to very important people. There's Baal Beru, there's the site belonged to Melchochnol MacDonald on Loch Innel. And so that era of ringforts, nothing lasts forever, nothing gold can stay, as I think Robert Frost would say. That time ended. It ended partly because of the Vikings, partly because of just evolving economies, but it definitely came to an end, and ringforts were no longer lived in after, well, as I say, after 850s and certainly after 900. So that is all I want to talk to you about. There's certainly more about ringforts that you can read in the literature if I haven't managed to kill your interest in them. These sites, very few of them have recorded history, but very many of them have been excavated, and we know how they worked. We know what the economy was of the people that lived in them. We know what the people did. We know how the tasks, the gender, the duties of women were different than the duties of men. The difference of boys in a ringfort were different than the duties of girls. We know all about what happened in them. I said once that these people, we do not know their names, but they're not anonymous. They were people, and there's a farm, and every ringfort represents generations of family farms. And this, as just to return to what I said earlier, this is where the money comes from. This is what drives the golden age. This is what makes the Book of Kells possible and the Ardagh Chalice. This is, if you like, it's the people in these obscure sites that make everything possible, all the achievements of early medieval possible. It comes from sites like that up there in Ikerrin, west of the Devil's Bit. Thank you very much.